Number 1.
At a young age, I had an experience that still haunts me, and I wish I could forget it, but I can't. I was around 6 or 7 years old, attending a summer program that my parents had signed me up for. I was in the group for the youngest kids. One day, while our group was at the playground, an older man sitting on a bench started talking to me. He knew my name, and I felt oddly comfortable with him, as he seemed friendly. He gave me candy, which I ate right away, and even offered to push me on the swing. I think I politely declined, but kept chatting with him, asking the kind of questions only a kid would. He introduced himself as Robbie, a name I still remember, and said he was a friend of my mom's. He told me that since she was running late, he would pick me up after camp. I agreed, thinking nothing of it, and soon after, our counselors called us to line up by the gate to leave. When we got back to our group's area, where we waited for our parents, I saw Robbie approaching. He told one of my counselors, Cal, that he was there to pick me up since my mom wasn't available. Cal checked with me, and I nodded that I knew him. He marked me off the list, and I left with Robbie. I remember he held my hand as we walked, and I noticed that he was walking unusually fast. We reached his car, and he hurriedly let me into the back seat, locking the doors and driving off quickly. When I asked if he was taking me home, he simply replied, "Yeah." I then heard shouting from outside the car. When I looked out the back window, I saw my counselors pointing at the car to a supervisor. This is when I started to feel really scared. Robbie yelled at me to get down, which terrified me. I tried to open the door when we stopped at a red light, but it was locked. He tried to calm me down, saying he was just taking me home, but I began to doubt it as we drove for a long time, and I didn't recognize where we were. My fear grew as I realized we were nowhere near my house. Robbie kept muttering under his breath, clearly upset, and kept checking the rear-view mirror. Then, the sound of a police siren behind us made him yell in frustration. He pulled over and told me to go along with whatever he said, but he didn't get the chance. 2 police officers rushed out of their car, ordering Robbie to get out with his hands up. He complied and was handcuffed on the ground. One officer stayed with me, comforting me and asking questions, while another cop car arrived, and soon after, so did my mom, crying as she hugged me. Later, I found out that when Robbie was walking me to his car, my mom had just arrived to pick me up. When Cal told her that someone had already taken me, they immediately ran to see what car we had gotten into and called the police. One of the camp supervisors followed us, which helped the police locate us quickly. This memory is deeply disturbing and sickening, and I often think about the terrifying possibilities of what could have happened if I hadn't been saved in time.
Number 2.
One night after a particularly hectic shift at work, my coworkers and I ended up clocking out later than usual. The store had been busier than we anticipated, so we stayed to clean up before heading out. Despite the long night, I had plans to hang out with 2 of my coworkers, and we decided to unwind by sharing a smoke and grabbing a bite at Wingstop. The night seemed ordinary enough, and before we knew it, the clock struck 1 a.m. I realized it was getting late and that I needed to head home. However, I also noticed that my car was dangerously low on gas, so I said my goodbyes and drove to the nearest gas station, which was thankfully just around the corner from work. This particular gas station, though close, was one I typically avoided, especially at night. It had a reputation for attracting trouble, with frequent reports of fights, hit-and-runs, and unsettling encounters with people who hung around there. However, with my car nearly out of fuel, I didn't have much choice. As I pulled up to the pump, the reality of the situation began to set in. I was alone at a secluded gas station, tucked away behind buildings, with no other cars or people in sight, and it was 1 o'clock in the morning. I got out of my car and reached back inside to grab my wallet, feeling a bit uneasy. When I stood up again, I noticed a man who appeared to be homeless rummaging through the trash nearby. He was holding an enormous white bag, the kind that seemed far too large for everyday use, and I couldn't see through it. The sight of him startled me, especially since he had approached so quietly. I quickly swiped my card and glanced over at him. By this point, he had his head buried in the trash, seemingly searching for recyclables. Trying to stay calm, I focused on getting the pump to work, and, to be cautious, I locked my car doors again. That's when the situation took a chilling turn. The sound of my car locking must have caught the man's attention because he suddenly looked up and made direct eye contact with me. He was tall, probably around 6 feet 4 inches, but extremely thin, with visible injection marks all over his body, peeling skin, and a buzz cut. Despite his condition, his face still had a certain sharpness to it, indicating that his struggles hadn't yet fully taken their toll on his appearance. He then said something that sent a wave of fear through me. "Look, they gave me a bag big enough to fit a dead body in." The words didn't seem real at first. I felt the color drain from my face as I tried to process what he had just said. The man then picked up an old, rusted kid's bike from the other side of the trash can and started moving toward me, one slow step at a time. As he got closer, he kept talking, saying things like, "I'm not going to take you. We're not going to take you. Don't look scared. Look pretty." His tone was eerie, almost as if he was trying to reassure me while doing the exact opposite. At this point, my heart was racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I began inching my way back toward my car, trying to stay calm while every instinct was screaming at me to run. As soon as I was close enough, I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was another man hiding behind the pump, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. It was clear that whatever they had planned, it wasn't good. I didn't wait to find out. I floored the gas pedal and sped out of there as fast as I could. My mind was racing with all the horrible possibilities of what could have happened if I hadn't gotten away in time. The thought that the second man might have been waiting to sneak up on me from behind was terrifying. He could have tried to overpower me, or worse, use something to knock me out, leaving me helpless. As I drove away, my hands were shaking and my heart was pounding. It was only after I had put some distance between myself and that gas station that I began to calm down. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to escape that situation unharmed. I don't even want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't been paying attention, or if I had hesitated for even a moment. That night served as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in unexpected places. It's so important to stay alert and trust your instincts, especially when you're alone and vulnerable. I'm incredibly grateful that the situation didn't take a darker turn, but it's an experience that will stay with me for a long time. Please, always be careful out there and never take your safety for granted. You never know what could happen when you least expect it.
Number 3.
When I was around 10 years old, my uncle owned a remote property in the woods of Kentucky. It wasn't too far from our home in Virginia, so we would often drive down there for a change of scenery. My uncle was an enthusiastic hunter, and his cabin was situated deep in the woods, making it an ideal spot for his hobby. Whenever he wasn't using the place, he'd let my dad take us there for a peaceful escape from our suburban life. We all appreciated the seclusion, and it became our little haven away from the bustle of everyday life. I've always been fascinated by nature, so one of my favorite things to do while we were there was to go on solo hikes through the woods. I loved exploring the trails, listening to the sounds of the forest, and just being surrounded by the tranquility of nature. But one late afternoon, something unusual happened that would change the way I felt about those hikes. As I was wandering along a familiar path, I started to hear what sounded like footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be the echo of my own steps, or maybe an animal rustling through the leaves. But as I listened more closely, I realized that these footsteps sounded distinctly human. I quickly turned and began walking back the way I came, feeling a little uneasy. When I reached the edge of the woods, I spotted someone standing behind a tree, partially hidden, as if they were trying to avoid being seen. Panic set in, and I sprinted back to the cabin as fast as I could. Once inside, I told my dad what had happened, that I felt like someone was watching me in the woods. He listened calmly but told me to stay within the boundaries of my uncle's property and not to wander off too far. Honestly, I had no intention of going back outside that day. A little while later, my dad and my 2 younger brothers decided to head into town to pick up a pizza. They offered to let me come along, but I chose to stay behind and watch the movie that was playing on TV. I'd been alone in the cabin plenty of times before, and it never bothered me. It was a place that felt like a second home, and I was comfortable there. As I was lounging on the couch, I suddenly heard footsteps coming up the small wooden porch at the front of the cabin. There was a knock at the door, and I jumped up, assuming my dad and brothers had returned. I was about to open the door when I hesitated, realizing it was far too soon for them to be back. Something wasn't right. "Dad," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. From the other side of the door, a voice replied, "It's not your dad, but we need some help." My heart sank. I glanced out the window next to the door and saw a man standing on the porch, someone I didn't recognize. He noticed me peeking through the window, and when our eyes met, he smiled, a smile that sent chills down my spine. I quickly closed the curtains and yelled out, "Dad, there's someone at the door," trying to make it seem like my dad was still home. But the man on the porch wasn't fooled. "We saw your dad leave just a bit ago," he said, his tone insistent. "Just open the door. We need some help." Instead of responding, I bolted for my uncle's master bedroom to hide. My heart was racing as I tried to think of what to do next. Just then, I heard a tapping sound at the bedroom window. I looked over and saw a second man standing outside, staring right at me. "Open the door, please," he shouted, his voice full of urgency. My fear escalated when I heard the front door being kicked. The door was old and flimsy, and it didn't take much for it to give way. I was terrified and knew I had to act fast. I remembered that my uncle kept a shotgun in his closet and that he had taught me how to use it in case of emergencies. Without thinking twice, I grabbed the gun and positioned myself near the bedroom door. As the door creaked open, I saw the tall man from the porch step into the room. He froze when he saw the shotgun aimed directly at him. His expression changed from menacing to nervous, and he quickly raised his hands. "Whoa, calm down," he said with a shaky laugh. "We're just leaving, okay?" Keeping the gun trained on him, I watched as he slowly backed out of the room, his hands still raised. He moved toward the front door, and his friend joined him. Together, they disappeared into the woods without a vehicle in sight, which made the situation even more unsettling. A few minutes later, my dad and brothers returned to find the front door broken in, and me standing there, still holding the shotgun. I explained everything that had happened, and my dad immediately called the police. They arrived quickly and stayed with us while my dad did his best to secure the door. The next time my uncle came out to the cabin, he installed security cameras and reinforced the door with something much sturdier. A few years later, he decided to sell the property, but the memory of that night has stayed with me ever since. It was a terrifying experience that taught me to always trust my instincts and to never underestimate the dangers that can lurk, even in a place that feels like home.
Number 4.
This story takes place on what turned out to be one of the most harrowing nights of my life. My relationship with my ex-girlfriend, Emily, had just come to a dramatic end after an explosive argument in her car. We were yelling at each other so loudly that I'm sure the whole neighborhood heard us. In the heat of the moment, she told me off, slammed on the brakes, and kicked me out of the car, leaving me standing in the pouring rain in the deserted parking lot of an abandoned office supply store. It was late, too late to call my parents, who were probably fast asleep by now. My sister, who might have been able to help, was out of state, so I didn't even bother trying her. I figured my best bet was to call for an Uber, so I pulled out my phone and started requesting a ride as I began to walk toward the street. But as luck would have it, every single Uber I tried to book either canceled on me or didn't show up at all. One after the other, they let me down. I was soaked to the bone, exhausted, and just about ready to scream in frustration. The situation was getting to me. I was only a 15-minute walk from home, but it felt like miles. Finally, I decided to tough it out and just walk the distance. Not long into my walk, a dark SUV pulled up beside me. Inside were 3 men who looked to be in their early 30s. The guy sitting in the back seat rolled down his window and called out to me, "Hey man, need a ride?" I hesitated for a moment, weighing my options. It was late, cold, and wet. I was tired and just wanted to get home. Against my better judgment, I thought, what do I have to lose? It seemed like a better option than trudging home in the rain, so I climbed into the back seat, thanking them as I settled in. I gave the driver my address, and we started off. To break the awkward silence, I tried making light of my situation by mentioning that I'd just broken up with my girlfriend. I was hoping to get a little sympathy, or at least some small talk to pass the time. But instead of laughing or responding with any kind of empathy, the guy in the front passenger seat slowly turned to look at me. His expression was unsettling, blank, almost emotionless. His eyebrows were slightly raised, and his mouth hung open in a way that felt more threatening than anything else. I tried to brush it off, but the way he just stared at me, without saying a word, sent a chill down my spine. I quickly averted my gaze, looking out the window, but I could still feel his eyes on me. Then the GPS voice broke the tension, instructing the driver to turn right at the next street. But instead, the driver made a left. My heart skipped a beat. I think you went the wrong way, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The guy sitting next to me in the back seat, who hadn't said much until now, just leaned in and said, Nah, it's cool. Just relax, man. The lack of communication in the car was only making things worse, and the uneasy feeling in my stomach was growing stronger by the second. I noticed that we were heading into a part of town that was eerily quiet, with hardly any houses or buildings in sight. The streets were deserted. I knew I needed to say something, even though I was terrified of how they might respond. Summoning up the courage, I asked the driver to just drop me off. I told him I could walk the rest of the way. His response was chilling. He just laughed. The guy in the front seat joined in, and their laughter echoed through the car, cold and unnerving. That's when I heard the distinct sound of the doors locking, and the car began to slow down. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I knew in that moment I had to get out of there. Without wasting another second, I reached for the door, flicked the lock back up, and pushed it open. The guy sitting next to me lunged, trying to grab my arm, shouting, "Get him." But I was quicker. I managed to slip out of his grasp and bolted from the car, sprinting toward a small patch of trees that lined the edge of the road. I didn't stop running, not even as I reached the parkway, with cars still speeding by. I risked everything, dashing across the busy road, narrowly avoiding the oncoming traffic. My heart was racing, and adrenaline was coursing through my veins as I pushed forward, desperate to put as much distance between me and those men as possible. To this day, I'm not sure what their intentions were, whether they were planning to rob me, kidnap me, or something even worse. All I know is that their behavior was far more sinister than a simple mugging. If all they wanted was my money, they could have easily taken it and driven off. But they didn't, and that's what haunts me the most. That night could have ended very differently, and I'm grateful every day that I managed to escape. It was a terrifying experience that taught me to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never take my safety for granted.
Number 5.
It was a typical Friday night, and like most teenagers our age, my friends and I were looking for a bit of excitement. I was 14, and my two closest friends, Alex, who was also 14, and Jamie, who was 13, had come over for a sleepover. The night had been filled with video games, snacks, and the usual banter, but as the clock struck 1 a.m., we got that familiar itch for a little adventure. "We should sneak out," Alex suggested with a mischievous grin. The idea of exploring the town under the cover of darkness was too tempting to resist, so we grabbed our hoodies and quietly slipped out of the house, careful not to wake anyone. The streets were eerily quiet as we walked around the local town, chatting about school, life, and whatever else came to mind. There was something thrilling about being out so late, knowing the world was asleep while we wandered. But as we began making our way back, the fun started to fade into something more unsettling. We were approaching a T-junction that led to a local street, the path home. The streetlights had turned off at 1 a.m., plunging the area into complete darkness. As we passed a closed shop on the corner, we noticed a beat-up white van turning around the corner. It seemed ordinary enough at first, but then Alex made a joke that sent a chill through us. "Wouldn't it be creepy if that van was here to kidnap us?" he said with a nervous laugh. But when the van suddenly stopped right next to us, our laughter died in our throats. There was no reason for it to stop. Everything was closed, and there wasn't a soul around. We stood frozen for a moment, processing the situation, before our instincts kicked in. Without saying a word, we bolted down the pitch-black road toward Alex's house, our hearts pounding in our chests. We ran for what felt like an eternity, but it was only about 15 to 20 seconds before we stopped, breathless, to regroup. We whispered frantically, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Our nerves were on edge as we continued walking down the short road leading to Alex's house, constantly checking over our shoulders. That's when Jamie and Alex noticed something that made our blood run cold. A man had appeared, walking around the same corner where the van had stopped. There was no one else around, and it was clear this was the driver. He seemed to be watching us, his presence sending waves of fear through us. We exchanged worried glances, questioning who this man was and why he was following us. Before we could make a plan, the man suddenly dipped back around the corner, disappearing from sight. Seconds later, the van came speeding back around the corner, and without thinking, we took off running again. This time, we veered right onto a new road, our footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. The road we turned onto had several side streets with houses, and luckily, Alex's house was on the first street to the left. We could hear the van getting closer, the sound of the engine roaring in our ears. We sprinted down the street, our fear propelling us forward. Jamie and Alex managed to dive behind some parked cars, hiding themselves from view, while I, in a moment of shock, stood frozen, watching as the van sped past the road we were on. The driver seemed to realize he had missed us, slowing down, likely preparing to turn around. But it would be difficult to make a U-turn on that narrow road. We didn't wait to find out what he would do next. We ran halfway down the street, Alex's house just visible at the end. We slowed to a walk, glancing nervously over our shoulders, trying to figure out what would happen if the van caught up to us. The adrenaline was pumping through us, and Alex, who was visibly shaken, began contemplating escape routes in case the van returned. Then, out of the corner of our eyes, we spotted a light flickering on. Panic surged through us, and we mistook the light for the van's headlights. Without a second thought, we sprinted the last few yards to Alex's house. It was only a 10-second run, but it felt like a lifetime. We reached his house and scrambled through his bedroom window on the ground floor, tumbling into the safety of his room. Now, as I sit here recounting the night's events, the fear and confusion still linger. We're all still shaken, replaying the moments in our minds, trying to make sense of what happened. It was supposed to be just a fun night out, but it turned into something far more sinister. We're left with questions and a deep sense of unease, grateful to be safe, but wondering what might have happened if we hadn't run.